This is the Celiac Project, two guys talking gluten-free. Just wanted to give a little disclaimer. We are not medical experts, doctors, dietitians,
Nurses.
bone experts, surgeons.
We're only experts at being celiac patients.
So enjoy the show. And if you're going to do any changes to your diet or need real medical advice, please go to the medical professionals.
That's what they're there for. We have an amazing treat for you. If you want to listen and watch this week's episode, you can go to youtube.com/@celiacproject and watch it there.
If you prefer, you can listen as you usually do. We hope to have some of our future shows on video as they are available, so look for that as well. Now let's get to the show.
Sounds good.
You found the Celiac Project podcast, two guys talking gluten-free. I'm Mike.
And I'm Cam.
And who's joining us on the podcast today, Cam?
Today we have Danielle Altonaga.
Danielle joins us from Canada. She has an amazing celiac story. Let's get to the show.
Sounds good.
Cam and I are so excited to be joined today by Danielle Altonaga. How are you, Danielle?
I'm well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
We're so excited to have you. Danielle actually reached out to me a while back, and it's just crazy. You had this YouTube story of yours up, and you reached out because you were interested in watching the Celiac Project documentary. And I watched your YouTube video, and I felt like we were like kindred souls, like just all of this stuff that we had in common growing up. I have a theater and film background, and you have that. We're both Jewish, and Cam is Jewish as well. I loved your story because you were so authentic and honest about sharing with people what you went through before you were diagnosed. We won't have you replay that whole thing. We can link your YouTube channel to ours when people are watching this, and they can watch the whole thing. But can you share with our listeners and viewers today just a little bit about your celiac story?
Sure. And thank you. Thank you so much for the compliment on the channel. Yeah, I started it very much as like a personal passion project because I am very passionate about this topic, as you'll soon see. And I also love that you used the term kindred spirit, because one of the first major plays I did was Anne of Green Gables, where that's I feel like that's where the modern usage of kindred spirit comes from, is the Anne of Green Gables kind of culture. But yeah, so my story is, like you said, sort of similar to yours, where I don't really have a lot of clear memories of like just always sort of having kind of stomach issues as a child, like as early as like 3 years old. I just remember like, having an upset stomach, but that was my reality. So I didn't know that there was anything different. It really started to affect me, I guess, around the ages of between like 8 and 10. And at that point, my parents, very responsibly took me to the doctor. We went for sort of all the tests that were available at the time, and nothing really came up. So at that time, like many celiac patients that I've heard from, I was diagnosed with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which is, I feel like a fancy way of saying we don't really know what to do for you. Good luck. So, I did my best to quote unquote control my sensitive nervous stomach. I was also told, I need to work on relaxing. You're too tense, you're a perfectionist, right? You need to calm down. And that is true, actually. But I feel like it's sort of a separate issue. Probably does contribute a little bit sometimes to stomach upset. But yeah, so I was labeled sort of as, oh, you have a nervous stomach. You just, got to work on managing your stress and be careful what you eat. So I tried to do that. But when I got to high school, I started having really bad, like episodic, what kind of felt like the stomach bug. But then I realized, it's not normal to get the stomach bug like once a month. And yeah, but I just thought, we did the medical research. There's nothing to really do. I guess this is just what I have to sort of cope with in life. And as I think you mentioned, my background is in acting. I was busy. I was at a performing arts high school. I was acting professionally at the time. And it was one of those, like, I don't have time for this. Like, I'll deal with it, and I'll be in the bathroom and then I'll go to my performance or my shoot or my audition or whatever it was. So I just dealt with it because I really believed that there wasn't anything to do about it. It sort of came and went over the years, these episodes. And I think when it really came to a head was after. So I have several lovely boys at home. They are 6 years old, 4 years old, and 9 months. So when I had my second son, just shortly after, I started to get episodes, but they were really, really severe in nature, like beyond just the stomach. I started to have swelling in my hands and face and lips and tongue. It actually, if you're familiar with anaphylactic reactions was what it seemed like. And I do have a history of anaphylaxis to fish. So I was like, so I'm probably allergic to something else. I never really connected it to the whole stomach piece. I just thought, oh, I have some new sudden allergy. But between, my regular doctor, my allergist, I saw like an endocrinologist because I was having thyroid problems postpartum, nobody could figure anything out. But the symptoms were so severe and so scary that the allergist actually gave me an EpiPen because, as I said, in addition to the stomach stuff, I was having like swelling and hives and a little bit of shortness of breath even. I never did go to the ER for it. But yeah, so that happened about 9 times in, I think, like 2 or 3 months until we figured it out. But it was at that point that I became very determined to get to the bottom of it, to find an answer, because I realized this is not normal. And I think, as a parent, something changes in you where I said to myself, this is not just about me anymore. Like, I can't take care of my family right now. And I had a particularly poignant moment. I remember, Michael, you were talking about, it might have been in one of the podcasts or in the documentary, where you're talking about sort of driving aimlessly and just feeling like lost. And I felt like that physically and emotionally, like looking back for a long time, really. And I thought it was sort of a mental health thing, like a life transition thing. But I realized it was just my body feeling kind of off all the time. But yeah, something shifted in me where I said, I'm a parent and my son is 2 months old. I was, nursing at the time, but I wasn't able to nurse my son. My husband had to give him a bottle because I was lying on the floor, like unable to move. And I said, this will not do. This will not do anymore. Like, we really have to get to the bottom of this. And so I just didn't stop until I found an answer. And thank God it didn't take that long to get to the bottom of it. Once I was so determined, it took a few months to figure it out. And yeah, it just completely changed my life. And similar again to Michael, I'm so happy to have that diagnosis, to have an answer, to know what to do, to be able to go forward and live a better life.
Thank you for sharing that story and just talking about, it's a really good point when you begin to have a family. And I have another thing in common with you because when we had my first daughter, I was not yet diagnosed and I felt like a shell of myself. Like you're saying, I wasn't maybe laying on the floor, and I don't know what it's like, obviously, to be a mother and to have, personally brought the children into the world, but that's got to be a really powerless feeling. And yeah, I couldn't agree more when you shared in your video the relief that you had when you had an answer to all of this that was going on, and you start to trace everything back to, oh, that's why, everyone should watch Danielle's video because she goes into some details about some harrowing stuff from her childhood that we can all relate to. And it's just really nice that you have an answer and you can now be present, for your family and sort of get the health stuff back on track.
Yeah, I'm really, really thankful. And I know that so many are undiagnosed. I think it's a similar statistic in the US. Like, I'm in Canada, but I think it's around something like 85% of people with celiac don't currently know they have it. So I find myself, and this is why I find this type of thing so important to have these conversations and why I'm so grateful this podcast exists, because how many people are walking around going, oh, I guess I'm just a perfectionist and I need to calm down, or I guess I just, can't eat spicy food or whatever it is.
Right. Or like you said to you, I really liked your video as well. I thought you had a really great point when you talked about all the symptoms and celiac being did you call it the great pretender? Well, I can't.
Yes, that's in the book, Celiac Disease, a Hidden Epidemic. And yeah, they called it the great pretender just because it can mimic so many other illnesses and syndromes that, I think there's over 300 symptoms associated with celiac. And I definitely had some of the weirder ones.
Yeah.
So.
And then connecting back to what you had just said, like for myself, it was always, they were like, oh, it's lactose intolerance. But I always say it wasn't the ice cream, it was the cone. It wasn't the cheese on the burger, it was the bun. Like, I always had those sort of correlations. So I totally can relate to what you're saying. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners can as well. I thought your video was so great too. It was just so concise and educational at the same time. And you got to share your story. So it's really cool. And I'm happy that you're getting to share with us today. And then I was going to actually ask you if it was correct that you lived in Canada, but you had just said it. And I wanted to ask you is, some people in the US found that Canada was maybe a little more advanced in the celiac, not treatment, but like the availability of food and items and things like that, as far as at least earlier 70s, 80s, early 90s, things like that. What was your thoughts on support and ease of living in Canada with celiac disease?
So I'm thankful to say I've had a very good experience so far leading up to the diagnosis. As I mentioned, it wasn't, entirely clear. And I feel like I did have to sort of fight to be tested to get that initial test. But once I had the diagnosis, the gastroenterologist I was referred to was excellent. So I was able to actually get in for an endoscopy about 2 weeks after my positive blood test, which is pretty unheard of. Like people tell me they wait months, but one of those squeaky wheel gets the grease, kind of times where I emailed the office and I said, listen, I have a baby and I'm not functioning. I will come in anytime. If you have a cancellation, I will literally come in anytime. So yeah, I was very thankful that they were able to get me in 2 weeks later. And they told me on the spot, we do need to review what we've found in this endoscopy, but you do appear to have celiac disease. You need to go gluten-free right away. And a dietitian from the hospital will be calling you. So yeah, the hospitals, I'm here in Ottawa, which is Canada's capital, and the hospital that I was at was excellent. The dietitian called me again, also within several weeks, discussed the gluten-free diet and what to do about other issues. Like I was having trouble with dairy as well. So we talked about, how to work on my calcium, what deficiencies I might have. So I found the support really great from the medical community in that regard. And also here in Canada, it's formerly the Canadian Celiac Association. Now it's referred to as Celiac Canada. They have an amazing Facebook group. They have webinars. They have a yearly conference, which I believe was in person at one point, but pandemic and post-pandemic, it sort of moved to Zoom, where they had some of the guests that you've had. Actually, I know Dr. Leffler and like all kinds of experts and opinions. And really, I have felt very supported. And again, I'm thankful for that because I know that's not everybody's experience. I've heard horror stories in my support groups where they're like, don't eat bread. Here's a Google search option, like go home. And that is horrifying to me because it's a huge life-changing diagnosis. And I think we need support. And
Yeah, it's really nice. Every time we talk to someone from Canada, I feel like I'm a little jealous, just that things seem very streamlined as far as Cam was alluding to. Many people that I know that were diagnosed in like the 70s and 80s in the US had to actually order their food from Canada because that was the only, I think, edible stuff at that point. And just that it sounds like the supports there sound very organized. And I understand Canada's maybe a little smaller than the United States. And it just feels like everybody's sort of more on the same page. I think we're doing great in the US, but I do like the streamlined nature of Canada. We've been talking a lot about your YouTube video. And as I said, it was great that you put it up there to share. I'm so curious, what kind of feedback have you gotten? It doesn't all have to be from the video that you shared, but in any support groups that you've been in, how do people react when they hear your story?
again, I'm thankful that I have had, I feel like, a lot of support. Like I was actually a little bit nervous just because it is such a vulnerable video, like to share with so many people. So I sort of only shared with like a handful of friends and my immediate family and in-laws, but the support really has been great. I feel like nobody has made me feel bad about it. Like I've also heard that, in some families, people are still like gluten-free, that's not a real thing, or like that's a bad diet. So I haven't gotten any of that. I think there is a fair degree of education. Interestingly, we didn't know this, like, because it happened sort of around the same time, but I have a first cousin and she has 3 children, and actually 2 of her 3 children were diagnosed around the same time I was. So before that, we hadn't even known celiac was in our family. And then an additional cousin of mine, actually in New York, was also diagnosed within like a 2-year period. This all happened. So it's been sort of a nice way to, connect with my family on that, because we're all, trading recipes and, talking about the struggles that come with it. So I have felt very supported, but yet the video in particular, I mean, I haven't shared it so widely. So I'm feeling more confident with all your good feedback to maybe do that more. And I don't know how many people, like, because I did mention, my history as an actor, it's been quite some time, like since I was, on screen, and I wouldn't have called myself, particularly famous or anything. So I don't know how many people would also make that connection, like to, I never had a YouTube channel like back in that day. Was YouTube even a thing? I feel like I'm dating myself. I'm 35. I don't know if YouTube was a thing back then as much, but yeah, the feedback I have received has been excellent. And I'm very thankful that my friends and family have been there for me.
And you had said when you made the video originally, what was your intention? Was it mostly like, was it like a self therapeutic thing, or was it to educate people? Like when you were getting your story out, like what was that big push that made you want to put that out there?
I think it was really both. Like, I think it was the need to share information, because I just said to myself, I cannot believe that I've been having symptoms since I was a child. I was 31, like all these years of the self-doubt and the pain and the whatever. And I could have just gone gluten-free this whole time. So I think it was partially frustration. Yeah, it was partially a need to tell this story, almost like a therapeutic getting it out, putting it out in the world. And yeah, I think more than anything, it was just wanting people to know, if you are in this situation, you're not alone. Like maybe you're before diagnosis, because I mentioned this in the video, how I actually figured it out. Ultimately, I never said like what it was that pushed me over the edge, that made me do the test. It was really that I didn't have an answer. My doctor said, you know what, I think you might have something called idiopathic anaphylaxis, which is when your body reacts in like severe, sort of autoimmune ways with no underlying cause. And I just couldn't. My husband too was like, I don't believe this. There's got to be something. And so I said, what does it hurt at this point? And I was in an allergy support group. There were like 50,000 people in the group. And I posted like my whole history and my symptoms and everything. And several people commented. I was like reading all the comments, and somebody said, I have celiac disease, and the, hives and the swelling and all that you're describing, those aren't typical symptoms, but that was something that happened to me. So maybe you should do the test. And that was actually what prompted me to recommend the test to my doctor. So I realized, obviously, and this is why you give the disclaimer at the beginning of your podcast, we're not doctors, and I don't claim to have any, medical professional expertise or anything like that. But there is a lot of power in connecting with other people sometimes when you don't have answers, and also in feeling support. So I thought, the same way that I watched YouTube videos and I went on these groups, I want to put my story out in the world so that maybe it'll fall into the right hands or the right ears. And maybe I will be the person that pushes somebody else over the edge. So it just felt like a giving back, like that positive energy came to me, and I wanted to put it back out.
That's lovely. Yeah, that's great. And it's a really important reminder. Like they say, there's around 300 or so symptoms of celiac. And just from the group that this podcast has spawned, we get together, and often people will be talking about a certain symptom, and there's almost always at least one other person who's dealing with it, even if you think it's a fringe thing. And so it's great that this is why I find boards like that can be so helpful. Often there's people sharing stuff that's not so helpful or whatever, but people who are really looking for answers, it's great that you were able to put everything out there and that someone found you who was experiencing similar things. To take a little bit of a turn, you and I were on email, and you told me that you'd been kosher for some years before you got your diagnosis and having to go gluten-free. And that's an interesting thing. My sister was going to go kosher at one point in her life, and she has 3 boys as well. And it was like hard to think of like certain things that you have to do when you're kosher. And this is something interesting that we've never brought up on the podcast before. So wanted to get your thoughts. She ended up going vegetarian, and then she has a son who's celiac and vegetarian. So how was your experience? Maybe, it's never easy going gluten-free, but were there parts of that made it easier to go gluten-free?
I think so. And I can definitely appreciate your sister's position, because I asked myself sometimes, would it have been as, going kosher is never a simple transition either. I said, like, would it have been a very different story had I received the diagnosis around the same time that I made that decision? And when I chose to take on eating kosher, that was quite a few years before my diagnosis, like I think about like a decade. So I really had time to get used to one before I had to take on the other. But yeah, for sure, keeping kosher involves just having an awareness of, I can't just go out and grab a burger, right? Like I have to either make sure there's kosher food available or pack a lunchbox, right? I love the saying that every day in life is a picnic for celiacs because we literally take our food everywhere. It's true. Every day's a picnic. So I was living with that every day as a picnic mentality for quite some time. Now, the reasoning, I guess, was different. Like that was sort of a spiritual, values based decision, whereas, celiac is obviously like a medical decision. But the actual going about it is very similar, right? You can't just put a product in your cart. You got to double check. And the same way that, a product used to be gluten-free. Oh, but now they use regular oats. Can't use that product anymore. The same thing happens with kosher products sometimes where something was previously kosher and now it's not. Or, oh, now they got a kosher symbol. This is so exciting. Yay, new product. So all of that is very similar. So I was already very attuned to that modality, like that way of living that I have to think before I open my mouth. So that was actually extremely helpful, although I am glad they were at different times because I think it's been a lot to do both at the same time. I also did take it on long before I was a mother, which I feel like would have been challenging too, to try to figure out like adjusting and feeding my kids. Because as much as I say, oh, I'm so grateful and it was so smooth, I don't want to misrepresent how difficult the transition actually was emotionally. I definitely did the crying in the grocery store. That definitely happened more than once, right? Where it's your favorite product. And then now I have this mental checklist, right? Because I'm allergic to fish, right? I mentioned I'm anaphylactic. I've got a kid with a nut allergy. So I'm like, yes, gluten-free. Yes, no fish. Oh, but it's not kosher, right? So I just this list that I go through. But I think already having that attunement, that awareness, that self-control really, right? Because I think that's a big part of it is we live in such a convenient world, right? In America and in Canada, right? Where you can just go out, there's like food everywhere. So I think having already adjusted to not being able to just grab whatever really did make the transition to gluten-free less terrible than it could have been.
And I should have you explain a little bit the rules of kosher eating to those listeners and people who are watching who don't know that at all.
Right, of course. So a common thing people say is like, oh, it's food that's blessed by a rabbi. That isn't really the case. It basically just refers to foods that don't contain certain things. So for example, like pork or shellfish, it means that the meat was slaughtered in accordance with like Jewish ritual slaughter. There are some Jewish laws around like how the animal has to be slaughtered. So things like that. A lot of it has to do with what's not in the food than more so than what is. What a lot of people are surprised to learn is that something like 70% of products on the shelves actually have kosher certification. Like a lot of stuff, it's not difficult to make it kosher. Again, assuming there aren't those ingredients like pork or shellfish in them. So yeah, it just has to do with food being supervised, that it's prepared in a certain way and that it does and does not contain certain things and that any meat is slaughtered in accordance with ritual slaughter. So yeah, if you look on a shelf, if you know what to look for, like probably the most common one in the US is a U with a circle around it, like you will start seeing it everywhere. My family in the US, who's been very supportive of my kosher journey when I visited them, it's like, I didn't realize there's circle U's on everything. So there's a lot more that's kosher than that's gluten-free.
And I'll point out to a lot of the people watching and listening that there's some wonderful brands like Katz comes to mind,
Oh, yeah, I
makes
love
the
that.
donuts that we eat. And they're, I think, kosher. We have a grocery store near us that has a large kosher section. And sometimes if you're having trouble finding certain things, you might want to check that section out. If you have a store like we have around us that caters to a large Jewish community, they will have the kosher and the gluten-free, some of it together. So just a little tip out there. But yeah, thanks for explaining that.
And there's another random tip around Passover or right after Passover. Lieber's has a flourless cake, and now they label it gluten-free, but I don't think they used to. It just happened to be gluten-free, but that is really good. So just
yeah, around Passover, I guess, because there's like the avoidance of like leavened products and regular flour. So I think they realized like this is really helpful to also put gluten-free on the packaging. And I don't know where I could find the statistic for this, but somebody told me recently that there's actually a higher, you know how certain populations, like ethnic backgrounds have like higher incidences of things. So apparently celiac disease is more prevalent within the Jewish community, I heard recently. So it makes sense, I guess, to once you're making those Passover products and it's naturally gluten-free because you're keeping it away from all the flour to just put that stamp on it.
I still have
Definitely.
my leftover gluten-free matzah in the basement that I've been hoarding once it went on sale. Anyways, because that can be a little bit pricey, as we all
Right.
know.
But
Definitely.
nobody wants it after Passover. So all the gluten-free people get really excited. You're like 94 cents.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what I was saying about the Lieber's cake. It ends up being like half off.
Right.
It's awesome. 2 for 1.
So I see that we're getting near the end of our time together, Danielle. Anything we haven't hit on today that you think would be helpful for our listeners to hear, either from your own experience, anything that you wish people understood about living with celiac, or anything you want to share at all?
I would say for starters, I think it's really important to have trust in yourself, in what you perceive is going on in your body. I think for me, part of the reason it took me so long to get diagnosed is I had sort of lost trust in myself and my own experience. I just thought, oh, my stomach's not a big deal. This isn't a big deal. And it had to get so bad for me to really wake up and listen. But I don't think we have to wait for it to get, so severe to ask for help and to look for answers. And of course, in retrospect, right, that's really easy to see. It's not always easy to see in the moment. I think what's also been an incredibly healing part of my journey is looking around and noticing, a lot of times you get a diagnosis like celiac, or, I don't think that's the worst diagnosis to get, but any diagnosis, and it's like, oh, it just hits you. This is so hard. And why me? And celiac has a particularly large social emotional component, which you touch on a lot in the podcast. But we have a choice in life, right? I feel like we really have a choice. And for me, obviously, because I was having such severe symptoms, my quality of life improved a lot. So there was a lot of motivation there for people that may have, silent celiac or less severe symptoms. Maybe it's not as, pronounced, but we all sort of get dealt a hand and we have a choice about what to do with it. And so I really have tried through, and not to, have sort of toxic positivity and like not honor the emotions, because I think I've really honored the transition and the emotional difficulty, but ultimately trying to come out, with an attitude of gratitude, saying, wow, like we live in a time where I can walk into, a 7-Eleven, or is that in the US too? Whatever, and find something, like maybe not everything, but find something. And I have an answer. And now I have a way to feel better. And, I've found this whole community that I haven't had before. So we have to live with it. We don't have a choice. So finding ways to find joy in it, to find that new gluten-free product, come home, call a friend or your spouse or family or whoever you connect to and say, guess what? I found gluten-free donuts. Like, to find those moments of joy and to find those points of connection, because it doesn't have to be something sad. Like, it could be something that actually inspires you, changes you, opens you up to the realization that everybody is going through something. I think my diagnosis has made me a more empathetic person. I look around, I find people tell me things, and it lands in a deeper way, because I know what it's like to have that hopeless feeling, to not know what's going to happen next. So yeah, I guess just taking it day by day and realizing that this doesn't have to be a bad thing. It could be a good thing. It could change your life for the better.
I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up today, Danielle.
I don't want to say anything else.
I can't help myself because I talk a lot, but Danielle, it's been so wonderful talking to you today and having you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Definitely. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening to today's show. If you like the podcast, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to the podcast. This will help other people find the show. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.